in relation to Black Lives Matter in particular, I think that they're wrong on their facts, and I think that they're wrong on their assumptions. I think in relation to their facts, particularly the movement in the UK, the idea that British police, that are perhaps the most demilitarized police in Western society, are institutionally or systemically racist is just completely nonsensical. There's very little evidence of that. If not, there's contrary evidence to that. And I think that that actual narrative is deeply corrosive. I think that I think it really sends a very negative message to young people in terms of their interactions with institutions. And I think it creates a very adversarial and hostile relationship between young Black boys in particular, but young Black people in general, and the institutions to which they are interacting with.
Okay, I'm joined today by writer, commentator and campaigner Inaya Folarin Iman. She regularly features on podcasts, panels, on TV and on radio, and is on the board of both the Free Speech Union and is the founder and director of the Equiano project. She's also one of the brightest and most astute voices in the discussion around race and just politics more generally. So yeah, I'm a big fan and I'm really happy that you've come on E2 Review. Thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, and I'm very happy to be here.
All right, so I mean, we're definitely going to get into your views on politics, the Black Lives Matter movement and stuff like that. But just to begin with, can you give me a background about kind of yourself and how you've got to where you are today?
Yeah, so I guess I'm born in London, but I've lived in many different parts of Britain, and I was raised by a kind of single mother in a kind of British Nigerian household, and she was very much that kind of conventional idea of what a recent immigrant from West Africa is very much hard work, personal responsibility, education, all of these kinds of things. And so those are the kinds of values that very much shaped my political thinking very early on, and my interest in politics. And so, yeah, and then, I very recently graduated from university, and I think it was really in university that really radicalized me into my kind of well-known criticism of identity politics and my passion for free speech. I'm very concerned about the way in which particularly young people are being, what I would regard as, indoctrinated into a very narrow way of thinking about the world. And I think it's doing a lot of damage in relation to our institutions and so on and so forth. So yeah, I've become very passionate about these subjects and hopefully trying to broaden the discussion on many of these culturally defining issues.
All right, so something you've spoken about, because I've listened to a few podcasts you've done before and seen you on TV and stuff. So something you sometimes speak about is how when you went to university, you kind of had a realization that things weren't going in the direction you thought they should be. So could you kind of go into that in a little bit of detail?
Yeah, so obviously, as I said, when I grew up, I was very much involved in ideas and debating and discussion. So I'd hoped that university would be a kind of continuation of that experience. That's what we regard university's purpose to be. But unfortunately, despite the fact that it was a very good experience, I was very much concerned about the lack of ideological diversity and intellectual diversity on campus. Very early on, there was a very particular narrative about race and colonization and British society, which not only didn't really ring true to my experience, my understanding, but what I just thought it was kind of factually wrong, or at least we should have different perspectives of that shown. And so I became very interested in engaging and shaping campus life, and so became involved later on in my university with the student newspaper and these types of things. And when I started to criticize some of the things that were going on campus, I did receive quite a lot of backlash. And so I started a series of free speech debates on my university campus. And again, it was met with a lot of skepticism. It was met with a lot of criticism. And it was really astonishing because for me, I always saw freedom of speech as, the fundamental bedrock of democratic society, the ability to kind of articulate your ideas without fear of, criminalization or significant censorship. But many people were framing free speech as like a mechanism potentially to spread hate, a dog whistle of the far right. And so it became very clear that there is a huge disconnect between many of these universal values or the kind of traditions of the Enlightenment that have been fought for and championed, and that project is not over. And I think that we've been very complacent the last couple of decades in relation to our fundamental values, and I think that it's time to very much re-articulate them for the present day.
Yeah, it's funny that you said you organised a bunch of events, some of them trying to look at things like free speech at university. And my initial thought is, oh man, she's pretty brave to do that. When what you're doing is organising just an event saying we should be able to talk about things openly. So that's kind of a sign of where we are at the moment, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I think, yeah, as I said, that when we talk about free speech now, it's often, we're talking about someone being cancelled. We're talking about, someone being accused of hate speech. We're rarely ever talking about free speech as the mechanism to kind of, push innovation, to understand each other, to foster mutual respect and tolerance. Is always framed recently in a very negative light. And that's, really worrying.
So you're on the board of the Free Speech Union.
Yeah.
So could you go into a bit of detail about what that is and how you got involved with that and what your aims are by being involved with that?
Yeah, so it was started not too long ago this year by Toby Young. I'm a well-known figure in British public life, and essentially, he started it probably because he experienced some form of cancelling before it was as famous as it is now. And I think that for a lot of people that have experienced that, whether they are high profile or just ordinary people, so to speak, there's very little support. It's very difficult from an institutional level. Many institutions, many business people, many colleagues are very scared to stand up for people. And a lot of the time when people say something on social media, it's dug up or this, that, and the other for expressing their legal rights of free speech, and are kind of pushed out of their job or censored. There's very, very little recourse. And so there was a massive vacuum on that. And there are free speech related organisations in the UK, but unfortunately, many of them have not been as forthright as they perhaps could have been in defending this particular issue. So yeah, I guess Toby started it in response to that. And very soon after launching it, the Free Speech Union has had hundreds of cases, particularly in the Black Lives Matter situation. There's been many people that have been attempted to censor as a result of their views. And so I think it's a really important organization. And I wanted to get involved because I think, again, one of the reasons why I'm very interested in free speech is because it's often the enemies of free speech in particular attempt to frame it as in opposition some way to people that look like me as such. It's meant to be something to attack minorities and all of these absurdities, when in reality, free speech is here to defend minorities. If you are a minority and don't have economic and political power, how do you change society? You do that by, freedom of speech and articulating your ideas. So I felt that I wanted to be part of an organization in some way that was trying to change that narrative about why free speech was so important.
So what do you think is the kind of general direction of travel with regards to the state of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and also just to express opinions and so on in the workplace and just in general life in the UK and across the West at the moment? Do you think we're at a worse place than we've been in recent years? Do you think things are getting better? What's your understanding of where we are?
It's a good question. I'm conflicted on it. Like I often think it's getting positive because, again, we've seen a growing number of people from a very broad range of backgrounds starting to kind of feel more confident to speak out against these issues. And a lot of people are feeling, this has gone too far, this whole political correctness gone mad or whatever, but definitely cancel culture and things like that have got mad. So I've definitely recently felt optimistic insofar as, every action has an equal opposite reaction. So the more that people push, inevitably there will be a reaction. That's why we've had things like the Free Speech Union, the Equiano project, organizations that have emerged to try and push back against it. But then on top of that, I am pessimistic in other ways. When we look at the kind of major institutions that shape our culture, whether that is the mainstream media, the universities, the education system, even the technology companies, these are incredibly powerful institutions that are quite specific on a particular area of the ideological spectrum. So it's like, even if different groups emerge, trying to create something as powerful enough to be able to shape the narrative is very hard. I mean, we saw the Harper's letter, where some of the most, well-known and powerful thinkers, Noam Chomsky, Salman Rushdie, Steven Pinker, these are incredibly important people in academia and cultural life. And even their letter trying to stand up had a little bit of an impact, but it hasn't transformed the landscape in the way that you would think powerful people would be able to do. So I'm very mixed on it. I think the way that it will change is if more ordinary people, come together and start saying fundamentally no to this.
All right, so on the free speech point, so this is something which I think about all the time, and I'm kind of conflicted on my exact position on the free speech argument. So what I think, I definitely have the sense that things are way too restricted in terms of what we're allowed to think about and the extent of the pressure to conform to a very narrow point on the kind of ideological spectrum on most issues. And now it's getting into things like you can't even go to work without having to be trained into a particular way of thinking, which whether or not you agree with that way of thinking, I don't know if that is something which I'm comfortable with, that amount of pressure to think in a certain way in society as a whole. But at the same time, the completely free speech as a principle argument, which I have a lot of sympathy with, I can see how that's also exploited, or not necessarily exploited, but it's something which often it's the people who are saying things which if I was to meet them and they were to say that to me, I'd find it just really disgusting or really offensive or really unpleasant, who are some of the most vocal in making the argument that free speech is under threat and that they can't say anything. And so I find it confusing because I can see the argument that often when people are making that argument, they're just trying to make arguments which we've kind of changed our normative system in society to make unacceptable. So they kind of legally can say it, but then when they say it, there's a big cultural backlash because our normative values have changed. What do you make of that argument? Is that something you think is valid, or is it just you've got a principled stance that free speech in and of itself is vital for society?
Well, the reason that the most vocal or vociferous activists with free speech are people that majority of the population might regard as fringe is because the mainstream in particular have abdicated their responsibility to it. So unfortunately, when that territory has been completely ceded, then the people that are perhaps on the more edges of the conversation end up being the loudest voices. So I think if more of us actually were very passionate about advocating for free speech, then it wouldn't be an issue that it was only advocated by the margins. But we also, for me, the price of free speech is worth paying. If the price of free speech is that a few far-right extremists that are in the infinitesimal minority when it comes to mainstream life get to say a few stupid, offensive, ridiculous things, when actually free speech enables all of us to actually be able to express ourselves and push, ingenuity and individuality, then perhaps I'm willing to accept that. But also I think that when we look at the progressive change that has happened, even just over the last century, transformatively, when we look at civil rights in America, but also, the changes that have happened in Britain, none of those things were achieved through censorship. So if we are looking at, why these particular fringe ideas and whether or not they should be allowed to, the reality is historically their existence in and of themselves has not prevented change from happening. So if their existence actually stopped the progressive arc of the way that the direction of our society was going, then I think there was a legitimate case to be made for that. But actually that's not happened. It's always been through all of us individually and collectively engaging in kind of social discourse and understanding ideas and arguing and being convinced. That's what's changed things, not necessarily a fringe group of idiots, which will probably always be there.
Yeah. So, all right. So the free speech situation can't really be discussed without also looking at the way in which a particular kind of, there's not one way of describing it, but I guess you could call it identity politics or critical social justice. It doesn't really matter, but that general way of thinking about things, that worldview has really risen to predominance. It started in the universities, in my opinion, and it's kind of just spread across society, and it's gradually marching through the institutions, I guess you could describe it as. So how would you describe the interrelationship between the two? And also, that's something which I know you've spoken out about a lot. So what is your opinion on that worldview?
The relationship between identity politics and free speech is a very interesting one. So obviously, I broadly define identity politics as the kind of politicization of someone's group identity or their kind of social category. So that could more often than not often become your race and gender, and so your racial identity is then elevated over who you are as an individual, and there's often prescribed characteristics of what it means to be a particular identity. And so the reason that many people, identitarians, are obviously so hostile to freedom of speech is because obviously, freedom of speech enables particularly people that don't necessarily fall into this very prescribed idea of what this particular identity category should be, to challenge them. And I think that when you are looking for something that promotes conformity, when it that promotes a very kind of narrow and rigid ideological framework, then obviously freedom of speech is hostile to that. Freedom of speech is the enemy of liars, charlatans, ideologues, and authoritarians. And often, these ideas are deeply authoritarian ones. So I think that from an identitarian perspective, it completely makes sense that you would not want to be supportive of anything that might challenge your ideological conformity. But in regards to critical social justice, obviously many of the critical theorists are very much influenced by, as many people have talked about, kind of postmodernist ideas, and they have a huge fixation on language. So, language to them essentially, creates discourses, and that constructs reality itself. And so obviously, if you believe that reality is created by language, you then want to very strictly define the parameters to which language can be communicated and people can articulate themselves. And again, so that would play to itself very hostile to free speech, because that would challenge your power structure, so to speak. And so I think that many of these ideas are quite intentionally hostile to freedom of speech, because, as I've already said, that particular philosophical principle undermines any attempt for one group of people to have a monopoly on the way society and ideas are articulated.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Also, the point about language is a really key one, I think, especially because that worldview and the people who subscribe to it really strongly, I think, are often very quick to redefine the meaning of different words, which essentially allows them to behave however they want because they've changed the meaning of the word. So a classic example of that, I've discussed that in this podcast I did with James Lindsay a while ago. They'll use the word violence and they'll redefine it to mean ideas that they disagree with or the structure of society and so on. And so if you redefine the word violence to mean ideas they disagree with, then if I say something they disagree with, I'm being violent towards them, which then means that they're allowed to be violent towards me, even though all I've done is suggest something in a kind of non-violent way. And if that's defined as violence, any response is essentially legitimized. So it's really subtle, but it's quite profound in terms of the implications it has as to how you act and what's legitimate behavior in the political sphere.
Oh, hugely. I mean, and we've seen this in relation to the complete, redefinition of racism, and it's happened so quickly, and many people haven't even, realized, racism for most people, and, I think that this is still what racism means, is discriminating against somebody based off of, their real or perceived racial category, or the belief that a certain race is superior to another race, or, expressing, racially prejudicial views against somebody. That's what racism is. And I think that's what most people still common sensely and intuitively understand it to be. But obviously we have this new movement that argues that racism, is essentially everywhere, that racism exists in all levels of our society, and it's no longer about, I think Helen Pluckrose uses the phrase, it's no longer about did racism happen, but how did racism manifest itself? So nothing essentially can ever be racist. And so you always have to take somebody at their word that racism happened, because racism is, embedded in our society according to them. And I think that's when they try to kind of reframe these definitions, it means that, you're fighting a losing battle.
Yeah, classic example as well is that they can ask you the question, basically, are you racist? And if you say yes, then they say, okay, great, you need to work on that. And if you say no, they say, okay, you've internalized it, so you don't realize you're racist. So it's just like a classic philosophical trick, but there's no way out of that once you've been essentially accused of something which there's no answer you can give other than affirming the fact that you are something they've accused of, which I think is kind of almost a pre-enlightenment way of looking at the situation.
Oh, huge. And, they do a very similar thing to ethnic minority people. Do you believe Britain's a racist society? Yes, okay, that's fine. We agree. If you don't, then that must mean you've internalized internalized white supremacy, internalized racism. Yeah. So yeah, it is anyone that disagrees with it, essentially.
Yeah. So how have you found speaking out about this stuff? Because you're from an ethnic minority, and I'm guessing, I mean, to some extent, it makes it easier to speak out, but it also means that you get a particular type of abuse, I'm guessing, or do you?
Yeah, so it's been really interesting because how to reconcile that, because I actually in some ways find it very frustrating that something that I'm saying is somehow to some people considered more authentic or legitimate than if I had a different skin complexion or from a different background. Many of the ideas that I'm saying are shared and expressed by many incredible and interesting thinkers, like people that you described, like James Lindsay and other people who happen to be of a different ethnic origin to me, but that doesn't mean that their contribution is any less important or valid. And I think it's really unfortunate that the nature of the debate has now been framed where you now somehow have to declare your particular identity in order to be considered legitimate. And I think that, and this is what I was saying earlier, the way in which many of these ideas, which are deeply contested and highly ideological, have completely permeated into our mainstream discourse without challenge. This idea that me as a Black person or a Black woman, have a unique standpoint that only I as a Black person can understand. That's an anti-Enlightenment idea, and it challenges the idea that we are all, as human beings, we may have different experiences, but we all share, ideas at a fundamental level. We all experience fear, love, hate, all of these kinds of things. So we can all empathize with one another. And that's a really important achievement, that we realize that these activists are actually rolling back. But yes, I mean, it's been, I would say, overwhelmingly positive, but it's definitely been saddening in other ways. I mean, it's positive because I think a lot of people feel relieved to hear that actually maybe I'm not racist, and the things that I'm thinking aren't just shared by, fringe far-right figures or whatever.
Yeah.
But I think it's been sad that things that are for me so obvious, or so, just, I think, observable reality, we're having to basically start from square one, describing, things that are self-evidently true in a debate. And so I think that is worrying, that we are so, we're at, we're at ground one at the moment. And I think there's a long way to go before we start to see some massive changes in relation to where we are at in the debate. In truth, the overwhelming majority of people are polite, are professional when they interact with other people. I think, again, I think there is a kind of exaggeration, I would say, or, a fabrication of the extent to which people are offensive to one another. I think most people do speak to each other, politely. And so when these activists in particular, say that, it's good to be sensitive to one another, I think most people know that already.
Yeah.
But I think that, as long as I want someone to tell me what they believe to be true, and that's ultimately it. So if you're so sensitive around me that you don't think that you can tell me what you believe to be true, then I think that we're not in a good situation. I don't think you even respect me then, if you think that I'm so sensitive and so infantilized that I can't handle something that you believe to be true. And you can be wrong. We can discuss. We can debate. But that doesn't mean that just be honest ultimately. And yeah, so I completely also agree with you. I think there is a huge hypocrisy that happens where many people want to argue that we should speak to each other in a certain way and care about our sensitivities, but again, when it comes to ideas they disagree with, then it's completely fine. I mean, I've heard some of the most derogatory language over the last few months against ethnic minority people that I've heard in a very, very long time, whether that's calling Munira Mirza a racial gatekeeper, and all of these very bizarre, very archaic phrases have come back into the mainstream, not by traditional white supremacist ethno-nationalists, but by so-called anti-racists. There's a huge contradiction there.
Yeah, it's completely mental in my opinion. All right, so moving slightly on, what is your view of, we've kind of been talking about it already, but the Black Lives Matter movement in general, what is your interpretation of it? Do you think it's got some validity? What's your understanding of what's going on, and what's your view of it?
Yeah, so I've been on quite a journey with it. At the beginning, I was incredibly hostile to it, just because I think that not just because of the Black Lives Matter movement itself, but just the general trajectory of the kind of nature of conversations in relation to race and identity has been very polarizing, very divisive, based form of activism, not really grounded in material reality, and it's been a lot of emotionalism. And I saw it as a very significant manifestation of that, and I still very much do. But I think that one of the things that I would give Black Lives Matter is, because they've been so what I would regard as extreme, I think that it has actually broadened the debate. So I think that in response to what they've done, a whole new generation of voices have really come out that have had a more increased platform to be able to moderate the debate in a more kind of grounded direction. But in relation to Black Lives Matter in particular, I think that they're wrong on their facts, and I think that they're wrong on their assumptions. I think in relation to their facts, particularly the movement in the UK, the idea that British police, that are perhaps the most demilitarized police in Western society, are institutionally or systemically racist is just completely nonsensical. There's very little evidence of that. If not, there's contrary evidence to that. And I think that that actual narrative is deeply corrosive. I think that I think it really sends a very negative message to young people in terms of their interactions with institutions. And I think it creates a very adversarial and hostile relationship between young Black boys in particular, but young Black people in general, and the institutions to which they are interacting with. I think that they're wrong on their assumptions. I think that Britain is not a fundamentally racist society. I think that it's self-evidently true, because any society that has essentially gone into a standstill over just the mere accusation of being racist is a society that is willing to listen to its minorities. I've lived in other countries in the world, and the idea that many of the countries that I've lived in would even give 2 seconds thought to a minority saying that they are racist, it's just completely not the case. And I think that Britain has a very complex history, has a very difficult history to contend with, but I think that Britain perhaps has done more than 99% of countries in the world to be able to reconcile with its history, but also to be able to integrate many of the new people that have arrived into these isles in the latter half of the 20th century and beyond. And so I think that there is more that our society can do. There is more that our society could be. But I think that the overwhelming majority of people get along, are happy here, belong here, and think that this is a good place to live, for regardless of where your background is.
So what do you think about the way in which the movement, and not just the movement itself, but also the wider societal response, has treated facts in relation to actually just the specific accusations made? Because something which really stood out to me is, as someone who's been looking at the stats on this stuff for years, is just how little of an impact stating the relevant facts has on people asserting things which are basically counterfactual. So a classic example is, there definitely is, in my opinion, a degree of over militarization and possibly bigotry in some of the different police forces in different states in the US, and maybe to some extent in the UK. But if you look at the statistics, it's not clear cut that this always disproportionately affects Black people or different minority groups, especially if you take into account other obviously really relevant factors, like what was going on at the time at which the policeman encountered the person who then interacted with the police in a particular way. Or another example is the George Floyd thing, which is unbelievably horrific. If you just show a video of that, but you don't show a video of an almost identical killing of a white person like Tony Timper, or there's a number of others in America, obviously that's going to make people who don't have the time to study this stuff all the time feel absolutely disgusted and furious at the fact that the police are just only doing this to Black people. And I'm not defending the police doing it to anyone. It's absolutely horrific if it happens to anyone. But if you have to surely have the wider context to be able to make an informed decision. But that just seems, you're not even really allowed to bring that into discussion, because it just gets shut down instantly as irrelevant, or you're trying to deflect. So how have you responded to that? What's your view of why that's so central to the discussion?
Yeah, I think I completely agree with you. And I think, that has been a very interesting and sometimes difficult territory to navigate. I mean, if you're a young person in particular, but if you are a journalist, it's much more Hollywood and interesting to have someone saying Black power, this country's racist, tear it down, than taking the often long and arduous and difficult work of actually finding out the nuances and complexities of the situation. Those two phrases don't sound as interesting as the phrase, tear it all down. down. And that's really unfortunate. I mean, many of the books that are on this, like, you know, books by Thomas Sowell, you know, Glenn Lowry and many other people, they're often very big books that, you know, talk about all of the details, analyze all of the different things that are affecting these particular statistics and whatnot. That's not very interesting, unfortunately, in our social media age. And I think that's very sad. And I think it's sad because obviously it shows the level of intellectual engagement of our society, where we are much, it's much easier for us, and we much enjoy having much more simple one-dimensional analysis of complex social phenomena. But it's also, I think it's sad because it does so much damage. The social consequences of it are horrific. When if you think something's one way and you create a whole policy and invest so much money in a solution that is completely missing the point, then no one wins out of that other than the people that get to line their pockets. And so, yeah, I think that, you know, that they're obviously, because of the American context and the historical legacy and complexities in that situation, I think that there is a very interesting and legitimate argument to make about the consistent, the ongoing relationship between race and policing and criminality within these societies. But I think that, again, there are many different reasons for that, and that there are cultural reasons, there are economic reasons, there are individual reasons, and we have to be able to talk about all of them and give all of them their fair hearing. And we must fundamentally separate the American situation from the British one. There is a whole group of people that are desperate to say that, like, racial politics in America was slavery, Jim Crow, segregation. And, you know, in America, for example, you know, people can even get married of different races. That never happened in Britain. Actually, Black Caribbean men are more likely to marry a white woman in London than actually a Black woman. So the situation is so fundamentally different. And I think it's really, really negative that people are trying to amalgamate it into this one Black experience of racism, oppression, and violence, which simply is not the full picture.
Well, yeah, a good example of that is people saying, like, hands up, don't shoot in the UK. It's just like, it's so weird. I don't understand. Like, the police don't generally go around shooting Black people in the UK. That it does happen, but it's not in any way comparable to the situation in the US.
Exactly.
So how have you tried to count? I mean, could you tell me a bit about the Equiano project and how that is an attempt to maybe respond to this?
Yeah, so after the Black Lives Matter protests, I felt that there was a lot of criticism of Black Lives Matter. Obviously, it was the minority, but there was a lot of critique. But so far, and I'm hoping that this is going to change, there's been not as much attempt to create a genuine alternative that is more powerful, more bigger and more compelling than the narrative of Black Lives Matter. And I think it's an ongoing process. It's not going to happen overnight. But I definitely felt that I wanted to use the position that I now have in order to effect some positive change within this conversation. There is a very strong and powerful liberal tradition of anti-racism, you know, even in America, you know, whether that is Martin Luther King, but also, you know, Frederick Douglass and many other people who emphasize our common humanity, who said that, you know, the superficial, you know, racialized categories that have been essentially invented and imposed on all of us are complete, you know, have meaning, but they should not be given the kind of weight that you know, society puts upon us, but also that the kind of thread that binds all of us as human beings is actually far more stronger and more robust. And it is really that principle that has actually led to the transformational changes that we have seen over the last century. It was, you know, that ended segregation, that ended, you know, that championed civil rights, the belief in our shared humanity, and each of us as individuals should be able to define our own destiny. And I think that is the kind of tradition that I fundamentally believe in at a very deep level. I don't believe that my race or my racialized category is the most interesting thing about me. I think there's much more to me than that. And that's what I hope other young people, regardless of where they're from, believe about themselves as well. And so that's why I wanted to start the Equiano project, and I've obviously launched it. And it's essentially an attempt to forge a coherent and consistent and meaningful liberal tradition that does want to combat racism, but also wants to champion our shared humanity, a form of humanism that where humans, you know, exercise their agency and take responsibility for their life. So that's a counter to this very specific manifestation of anti-racist activism, and that's what the Equiano project is hoping and intending to champion.
All right, well, that sounds really awesome. I'm going to put a link to that as well in the description below, so anyone can check it out who's watching this or listening to it. All right, that's great. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. You're welcome back whenever you want, and good luck with everything you're doing. It sounds really exciting.
Thank you.